They came looking for gold. What they found instead broke something inside them, something that no amount of prayer, no amount of confession, no amount of distance between themselves and that continent would ever fully repair. November 1519. Hernán Cortés and his men crest the mountain pass between the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and for the first time, they look down upon Tenochtitlán, the capital of the Aztec Empire. A city rising from the center of a lake like a fever dream, gleaming causeways, towering pyramids, floating gardens, aqueducts carrying fresh water across miles of open water. A population of perhaps 200,000 people, at a time when most European cities barely held 50,000. The Spanish soldiers wept. Hardened men, veterans of brutal campaigns, men who had seen the worst that the old world could produce, they stood on that mountain pass and they wept at the beauty of it. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who walked with Cortés and later recorded everything, wrote that they believed they were dreaming, that no words existed in Castilian Spanish to describe what they saw. But the dream did not last long, because Tenochtitlan had another face, one that the gleaming causeways and manicured gardens were designed to frame, to elevate, to make magnificent. A face carved in obsidian and painted in colors that dried black. The Spanish had arrived at the intersection of the most architecturally sophisticated civilization in the Western Hemisphere and the most systematically ritualized culture of flesh, sacrifice, and forbidden obsession the world had ever produced. What they witnessed in the weeks and months that followed was recorded in letters, in depositions, in the tortured diary entries of men who could not stop writing about what they had seen because they could not stop seeing it when they closed their eyes. Tonight we open those records. The forbidden archives are open. To understand what Cortés found at the heart of Tenochtitlan, you must first understand the man who sat at its center. Montezuma II. Huitzilopochtli, the great speaker, the ninth ruler of the Aztec Empire, supreme commander of an army that had conquered most of Mesoamerica, and, in the theology of his people, a living intermediary between the human world and the gods. Not like a god. Not merely beloved by the gods. A vessel through which divine will entered the physical world. And that theological designation, that sacred status, gave Montezuma something that no king in Europe, not even the most absolute monarch on that continent, had ever claimed with quite such terrifying completeness. Total, divinely sanctioned impunity over the bodies of his subjects. The Spanish recorded, with a mixture of horror and barely concealed fascination, the scale of Montezuma's household. Within the palace complex at the heart of Tenochtitlan, the emperor maintained what the conquistadors could only describe in their letters home as an operation of staggering magnitude. Estimates from multiple Spanish sources place the number of women kept for the emperor's exclusive use at several thousand, the exact figures varying between accounts, but never dropping below a number that stunned the Europeans into repeated, disbelieving recalculation. These were not women who had chosen this life, in any meaningful sense of choice. They came from every corner of the empire. Daughters of conquered nobles, sent as tribute. Young women selected from their communities by imperial scouts. Girls whose physical attributes matched criteria established by the emperor's household administrators. Criteria recorded in documents, evaluated with bureaucratic precision, as though the empire was cataloging livestock rather than human beings. Once inside the palace walls, they did not leave. Many never left for the rest of their lives. The theological justification for this was seamless, internally consistent, and absolutely impenetrable to challenge. Montezuma's desires were not personal. They were not the appetites of a man. They were the sacred hungers of a divine instrument. And to satisfy them was to participate in an act of cosmic maintenance. To keep the emperor spiritually nourished was to keep the sun rising, to keep the rains coming, to keep the world, in the Aztec understanding of reality, from unraveling entirely. This was not hypocrisy. This was cosmology. And cosmology, when it is sufficiently powerful, makes anything permissible. But the flesh rituals of the Aztec Empire extended far beyond the emperor's palace walls. They were embedded in the agricultural calendar, in the rhythm of planting and harvest, in the theology of growth and abundance that governed every aspect of Aztec life from the smallest village to the highest temple in Tenochtitlán. The Aztecs understood the relationship between human beings and the earth in a way that was profoundly, disturbingly literal. The gods had not created the world as a gift. They had bled for it. They had sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion, to fill the oceans, to make the soil capable of receiving seed. The universe, in Aztec theology, was not a benevolent creation. It was a transaction, an ongoing, desperate, mutually obligatory exchange between humanity and the divine. And transactions must be honored. The gods had given everything. Humanity owed everything in return. Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, was among the most ancient and disturbing deities in the Aztec pantheon. The god of agriculture, of seasonal renewal, of the skin that the earth sheds each year to reveal the green life beneath. His worship during the festival of Tlaquaxipulazli involved ceremonies so viscerally disturbing that even seasoned Spanish soldiers, men who had watched battlefield executions without flinching, recorded their accounts in language that struggles to remain clinical. Priests would wear the skins of sacrificial victims, worn like garments, for 20 days as the skin slowly transformed in the heat, as the priests moved through the city in this grotesque costume of human material, conducting rituals, accepting offerings, embodying the gods' promise that death was only the prelude to renewal. This was not considered monstrous by the people who witnessed it. It was sacred. The fertility rites associated with Tlaloc, the rain god, and with the goddess Xochiquetzal, the patroness of desire, creativity, and the flowering of all physical appetite, moved into territory that the Spanish found almost impossible to describe in their official reports without apology and revision. These were rites in which the boundary between religious devotion and physical expression was not merely blurred but deliberately, theologically abolished. The gods of growth and abundance demanded not just blood. They demanded the full spectrum of human vital energy. Priests and selected participants would engage in ritualized acts within temple precincts that served as living prayers. Not in secret, not shamefully, but openly, ritually, with the gravity of a sacrament, because in the Aztec understanding of the cosmos, there was no energy more potent, no offering more aligned with the desires of the fertility gods, than the raw force of human physical union, performed in their honor, on their ground, in their name. The Spanish could not process this. Their theology had no category for it. They called it depravity. The Aztecs called it devotion. Of all the rituals recorded in the archives of the Aztec Empire, there is one that stands apart from the others. One that is so calculated, so psychologically sophisticated, so deliberately designed to take something beautiful and transform it, by slow degrees, into something unspeakable, that even now, 5 centuries later, it reads less like a religious ceremony and more like a carefully engineered descent into madness. This is the ritual of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, one of the 4 creator gods of the Aztec universe, Lord of darkness, of the night sky, of memory, of sorcery, and of the inscrutable will of fate. He was considered both the most powerful and the most terrifying of the Aztec deities. A god who saw everything. A god who could not be appeased with ordinary offerings. Tezcatlipoca required a vessel. Once per year, in the month before the great festival, the priests would select a young man. The criteria were specific and non-negotiable. He had to be of exceptional physical beauty, flawless, by the standards of Aztec aesthetics. He had to be intelligent, graceful, and capable of learning the arts of refinement. He had to be, in every observable quality, the finest specimen of human existence that could be found within the empire. And then they told him what he had been chosen for. For 1 full year, this young man would live as a god. He would be dressed in the finest garments in the empire. He would be housed in the most beautiful quarters, served the most exquisite food, given every material comfort that Aztec civilization could produce. He would walk through Tenochtitlán attended by servants, garlanded with flowers, playing the sacred flute, and the people would bow to him, because to them he was not a young man anymore. He was Tezcatlipoca, made flesh. In the final weeks of his year, for young women, themselves of exceptional beauty, themselves prepared for months for this specific role, given the names of goddesses, were brought to him as companions. Whatever he desired was provided. Whatever pleasure the mortal world could offer was placed before him without restriction. The year ended in a crescendo of sacred indulgence so complete that it was designed to make the transition that followed feel, perhaps, less like loss. Because 20 days before the great festival, everything changed. The garlands were removed. The servants withdrew. The companions were taken away. And the young man, who had lived for a year as a living god, who had known every pleasure the empire could offer, who had been bowed to by thousands, walked alone to the foot of the temple. He climbed the stairs himself. He broke his flutes, one by one, on the steps as he ascended. And at the top, the priests were waiting. The accounts of those who witnessed this, recorded both in Aztec sources and in the horrified letters of Spanish missionaries, are consistent in one extraordinary detail. The young men went willingly, not because they were coerced in those final moments, but because the year had done its work. It had constructed, with terrifying psychological precision, a worldview in which this ending was not tragedy but completion. A life raised to such a pitch of beauty and sensation that its conclusion at the apex of the temple felt, from within the architecture of belief that had been carefully built around the young man's mind, like the only worthy culmination. This was the Aztec Empire at its most sophisticated, and its most depraved. And yet, and this is the detail that the forbidden archives cannot allow to pass without examination, the same culture that sanctified all of this operated under a system of social law that was, for ordinary people, extraordinarily, brutally restrictive. The hypocrisy at the heart of Aztec society was not incidental. It was structural. The Huitlatali, the ancient words, the collected moral teachings of the Aztec elders, preached a code of conduct for commoners that emphasized restraint, discipline, sobriety, and the careful, sanctioned expression of physical desire within the boundaries of recognized union. Young people were instructed from childhood that the undisciplined pursuit of pleasure was among the most dangerous paths a human being could take, that the gods punished excess, that the body was a sacred instrument to be used carefully, not squandered. Adultery among commoners was punishable by death. In some accounts, by stoning. In others, by strangulation. The records are consistent that the enforcement was real and the punishment was carried out with public visibility, designed not just to punish the transgressor but to reinforce, in the watching community, the absolute nature of the prohibition. Young people who violated the codes of conduct established for their class could face penalties ranging from public humiliation to execution, depending on the severity of the offense and the status of those involved. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in the palace complex at the heart of the same city, under the same sky, within the same theological framework, everything that was forbidden to the commoner was not merely permitted to the elite. It was sanctified. It was institutionalized. It was funded by the tributary labor of the very communities whose young people were being stoned for the crimes that the emperor conducted as sacred rite. The laws of the Aztec Empire did not exist to regulate human behavior in any universal sense. They existed to regulate the behavior of those who had no power. Power, in Tenochtitlan as in Versailles, as in every court and palace and gilded seat of authority that history has produced, exempted itself from the rules it wrote for everyone else. It called the exemption divine. It always does. When the Spanish finally moved against Tenochtitlan, when the siege came and the causeways were blocked and the aqueducts were cut, and the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere was systematically dismantled stone by stone, they told themselves they were doing God's work. And perhaps, from within their own cosmology, they believed it. The missionaries who arrived in the wake of the conquest carried with them a theological mission that was, in its own way, as totalizing and as absolute as the Aztec worldview it sought to replace. The rituals had to be not just stopped but erased. The temples had to be not just abandoned but demolished, their stones repurposed for churches, their foundations built over so completely that the physical memory of what had stood there would be buried under Christian architecture. The codices, the painted books in which Aztec priests had recorded their rituals, their calendars, their theological texts, their histories, were burned. Not all of them, but most. The Bishop Juan de Zumarraga oversaw the destruction of documents that represented centuries of recorded knowledge, on the grounds that they were instruments of the devil, repositories of precisely the kind of forbidden knowledge that could not be allowed to survive contact with Christian civilization. What we know about the rituals of the Aztec Empire, we know from the fragments. From the codices that survived, hidden, preserved by collectors or by Aztec families who concealed them at enormous personal risk. From the accounts of missionaries who recorded what they witnessed, even as they condemned it, because the scholar's compulsion to document proved stronger than the churchman's instinct to destroy. From the oral traditions of communities that found ways, over centuries, to keep the memory alive inside stories that sounded, to Spanish ears, sufficiently innocent to be permitted. But the psychological wound of the collision between these two worlds ran in both directions. The Aztec civilization did not simply encounter a more powerful military force. It encountered a worldview so fundamentally incompatible with its own that the meeting produced, in the surviving accounts on both sides, something resembling mutual existential horror. The Spanish could not accept what they had seen. The Aztecs could not process a theology that made their gods into demons and their sacred rites into crimes. The result was not synthesis. It was obliteration. One world ended. Another was imposed in its place. And the records of what had existed before were gathered into piles and set alight, because the victors understood, as victors always do, that the most effective way to reshape a civilization is not to conquer its armies but to burn its memory. But memory is more resilient than fire. The archives survived. Fragments, testimonies, buried codices, the letters of horrified soldiers who could not stop writing about what they had seen, the confessions of priests who recorded rituals in the very act of condemning them, the oral traditions of communities who kept the old words alive in the spaces between the new ones. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors, and the reflection of power, of impunity, of the sacred masks that every civilization places over its darkest appetites, never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.